Jacques Ellul regularly cited three primary influences on his work: Karl Marx, Søren Kierkegaard, and Karl Barth. The latter two influences disclose a fair amount about Ellul's approach to theology and ethics, but mention of Marx in this trio may complicate matters for some people. Ellul was not a Marxist per se. He taught courses on Marx, he wrote about Marx, and he was a fine reader of Marx. He often said it was the Marxist structural analytical method he most appreciated and used in his work. Yet, because he was a Christian, he could not completely take the Marxist yoke upon himself. Perhaps in another conversation we'll explore Marx's influence on Ellul, but in the conversation you'll be hearing in a moment, we'll be exploring the work of Karl Barth, and through that exploration, getting a picture of the theologian who significantly influenced Ellul. In fact, as Ellul put it in an interview, quote, "I recall the shock I had in 1936 in reading Barth's The Word of God and the Word of Man. It was an incredible liberation." Here's why Ellul uses such strong language when describing this discovery. Quote, "Barth was infinitely less systematic than John Calvin, and he was completely existential at a time when the concept did not exist. He put biblical thought in direct contact with actual experience. It wasn't armchair theology." In this conversation, we'll get a glimpse at the existential character of Barth's work as I talk with Daniel Rempel, someone whose dissertation, which he's currently readying for publication, says it all. Intellectual Disability in the Christian Life, a study in Karl Barth, disability, and witness. Of course, neither Ellul nor Barth are disability theologians. Such a theological category did not exist while they were alive. But, as you'll encounter in this dialogue, the lack of such categories being applied to their work doesn't mean it can't offer helpful resources for thinking about witness in and beyond disability. And so, with that, here's my conversation with Daniel. Welcome, Daniel. It's really great to have you here. Let's start, as we always do, on Personalist Manifestos, which is just ask the simple and complex question: Who is Daniel Rempel? What do people need to know about Daniel?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me. It is both a simple and a complex question because like most people, you wear many hats. And so probably people who are listening to a podcast like this will want to hear first about the academic side of things and the theology side of things. So in that sense, I'm a professor at a very small school in Manitoba called Providence University College and Theological Seminary. I teach a real breadth of courses there, everything from theology to ethics to biblical studies, because we're a small school. We got to do many things there. Um, but the other thing that takes up most of my time these days is I'm a father. I have two young kids, a son who's 4, a daughter who's 1. And I think I don't view those two vocations as distinct from one another. I think that one of the things I've learned, especially after number 2 came around, is the way that our various lives feed into one another, and the way as much as it might be helpful or beneficial even at times if I could keep those things a little bit more separate. I just don't think that's realistic. And I think that the work I do in the classroom feeds into the way that I parent, and the work that I do as a parent feeds into the what I take into the classroom and how I think theologically. And I mean, certainly the exhaustion feeds in both directions. I'm also probably too avid of a sports fan.
Hmm.
Being in Winnipeg, uh, big fan of the Jets. Um, we might win the Stanley Cup this year, but we probably won't. Um, uh,
Well, yeah. I mean, I've had conversations before about what it means to be a Canucks fan, and speaking of being a parent, actually, my eldest experienced what it is to become a true Canucks fan, where we lost to the Blues yesterday in overtime. So we were down and we scored a goal like right near the third period ending. So there was hope. And then that hope was dashed. And my son, my eldest, goes, Dad, my eyes teared up and I'm so sad. And I'm like, son, you are now a true Canucks fan. You know what it is to have your hopes up and have those hopes come crashing to the ground.
What a catechesis. Oh man.
It's so true. It's so true.
Oh
Anyway, I'm
man.
just a tortured Canucks fan over here.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
we can.
Jets, you know,
Yeah.
I would cheer for the Jets over the Maple Leafs and the Flames. 100%.
I think we're still new enough and probably isolated enough in being in the middle of nowhere that we don't
Yeah.
have that many people who hate us yet. Um,
Yeah.
so we'll
Yeah.
ride that as long as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. Enjoy it.
Yeah.
Enjoy the moment of, protection and celebration. Yeah. Anyway, I cut you off. I'm sorry. Keep going
Oh, that's all good.
with your meditations on being a parent, theological education, and yeah, I do see those things interrelating for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, um, we this I just earlier this week was listening to your interview with Carlos, and he says it really, really well, I think. So this is my plug for your podcast here.
Thank you.
The people should go and listen other episodes, but that one really, I think he stated really clearly the way that our identities. I think he says at one point that like the individual does not exist in and of themselves, and that we only exist within the relationships that we find ourselves in. And so, especially in when we get into professions or kind of public facing life, especially in spheres that some would think of as kind of more prestigious, so to speak, like a professor, is that we are this kind of unified whole that exists within ourselves and within nobody else, and that the act of scholarship is just what I do alone. Well, read the acknowledgments to anyone's PhD thesis, and you realize that none of this is something that we do alone, and that we're all kind of made up of these many parts, and the relationships that we find ourselves in. I'm away from home right now, just on a very, very quick trip away. I left yesterday morning. I go back home tomorrow, and I was walking yesterday by myself, and I was thinking, man, I miss my wife and kids because I feel like they have become a part of me in a way that, like, even to just be gone for a day and not and realize that I'm not going to see them for just a couple more days. It's like I'll be fine. I can survive that. But it kind of caught myself in realizing how much I was missing them because of how much they become a part of me. And so if that's true, how could that not feed into the other areas of my life, or the relationships that I have with my friends or my colleagues, or the things that I do at church, or like how can this not all be intersected with one another? And we like to think of these as all kind of compartmentalized aspects of our life, but I just don't think that's honest.
No, no. I think I've experienced what you're talking about. And of course, as a male who's in a position of, relative influence, not a ton, like I also teach at a small school, but it's it's still the case that you can just sort of take permission to be this
Mhm.
individual, right? Who self-made and in command of everything. But I don't think that's actually like if you identify as a Christian, that's the way that we're supposed to be. And I don't even think that it's like, even if you want to put that image out in the world, it's not actually an honest image of all the people who are making it possible for you to be where you be and put that image out there. But I find that life is so much richer when you don't um, go that route, but you go to the other route where like you're saying is how does watching The Floor is Lava this morning with my two boys somehow shape me into the type of person that is the person talking to you today? And it does. And it actually alludes like language, and we don't have to like develop a systematic theology of how that shapes me into the person that I am, and hopefully someone who is nice to be around, and when he does teach or lead or whatever, or serve other people, that like he does that in a way that is more attentive and kind and thoughtful and so on. But it does. And actually, there's the whole talk about dad bods, right? And I read this piece that was talking about, there's a lot of research into how women's bodies change when they give birth and become mothers and so forth. But there's actually less research, but still some about how dads' bodies actually change when they become parents, right? Like, and of course, the dad was like, well, you eat more and then you gain more weight and you have less time for exercise. So you like, you just become heavier and more out of shape, which is definitely true. But actually, like biochemical changes, like, if you are an engaged father, it will change your level of patience. It'll change your level of compassion, right? And I
Yeah.
definitely am a much more patient and compassionate person now than I was before I have kids, right?
Yeah, and I think that in kind of theological circles and in ethical circles, we don't often like to think about the mundane. It's not sexy.
Hmm.
Um, it's um, it's kind of relegated below these what end up being very kind of niche, um, kind of high level topics. But I mean, one of my like deepest convictions at this moment is like the Christian life is lived nowhere else other than where we are. And it sounds almost elementary to say that, but if that's true, no one can live their life exclusively in the extravagant. Everyone has to do the mundane things like eating and sleeping and bathing and all the other things. And when you find yourself in relationships with people, especially with kids, like, well, then now you're having to do that with them too. And so like, is there is there something about that mundane reality of getting my kid dressed in the morning or making him another peanut butter and jelly sandwich that is actually like the affected by my Christian convictions and the Christian life that I'm trying to lead, and then vice versa. Is there something about that I take into my understanding of the Christian life and the way that intersects with all sorts of other different areas.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I need to write a theology of PB&Js or something like that.
Probably. I mean, you and I had the same PhD supervisor,
Hmm.
and I remember one time, I was researching on technology, and there's, in a lot of people who are writing about technology, in academic and mainstream discourse, there is this espoused fear of disembodiment, and we had our first in Scotland, so I just started my PhD, and I'd become a dad for the first time, and so changing diapers, spit up, all that. And I remember saying to Brian, our mutual supervisor, I was like, all this fear about disembodiment, people should just spend time with a newborn. That'll put you back in your body right away, changing diapers, all this sort of stuff. And Brian goes, yeah, I mean, the feminist and womanist scholars have been telling that forever. He's like, people got to be listening, nothing like being, you know, electing to be in that situation or being forced in that situation to actually put back in your body and look at the world in a different way. And as per usual, Brian was right on that. Moving to an area of research that you're very invested in, you work in the area of disability and theology. So, what first brought you into the world of disability?
Yeah, you know, one of the really neat things about disability theology is that everyone does seem to have a bit of a story about how they got there. And for me, that story probably goes back about a decade. I had just finished up my undergraduate degree, studied at the little university that I now teach at. And I took a little bit of a roundabout way through, and I ended up finishing up um, my studies after the fall semester. And so, okay, now I got to go look for a job for the first time beyond just kind of the summer jobs that I had working construction or whatever. Um, but I didn't want to look for a job before Christmas after that whole thing. And so I was like, "Oh, I'll wait till after Christmas." But I don't know if you ever looked for a job in January before, but at least in Winnipeg, where it goes into a deep freeze for about 6 to 8 weeks, like nobody's hiring. And so I was just unemployed for longer than I would have liked. And I don't really remember how it happened, but I do remember that my mom, of all people, just kind of forwarded me this job advertisement, and it was for one of the local organizations that did disability support work. And she said, "Hey, here's something." And I said, "Sure. That seems like it could maybe be kind of meaningful work." I didn't know anything about it. I had never thought about the presence of disability and being with people with disabilities. Now, of course, in hindsight, I was able to look back and see places where I had made connections to people with disabilities, but I hadn't taken time to think about that yet at that point. And so I just kind of happened into this job. Um, it was a work-based date program, kind of an 8 to 4 Monday to Friday thing where people could come, and we served a number of people with varying levels of physical and intellectual disabilities. And I just fell in love with the work. Like the contracts and jobs themselves that we did were fine, but being with people with disabilities, it it started to kind of work on me a little bit. And I just, yeah, I really wanted to be in that work for a while. But I also had these lingering academic interests, and so I ended up going on to grad school, and I didn't move all that far. I only moved from the small town outside of Winnipeg into Winnipeg. Um,
To the
but it
big
was far,
city.
yeah, the big city. The country boy moved to the big city. And that meant that the commute that I had was just too much for the wages that were being paid at the time. So I got another job in disability support work, different organization. This was in a home with 3 adults with varying levels of intellectual disabilities. And while I was in grad school, I worked the morning shift with them, 6 to 10 a.m., Monday to Friday, getting them ready for work or for their day programs. Sometimes that included things like bathing and toileting. It always included um, getting breakfast ready. One of the guys we had to feed, and then just getting them ready for the day. And so I did that all throughout my studies. And it was early on in my studies that I kind of came in with some interests towards biblical studies. I had just kind of at the end of my degree been exposed to the world of theology and um, some of the stuff that, well, particularly the guy who was fascinating me back then and who still fascinates me quite a bit now is Karl Barth. And so I was talking about, what my life and my interests with one of my professors, and in a manner that's really similar to how I got my disability job in the first place. He just kind of happened to say, "Oh, why don't you see if you can bring that together? Why don't you see if there's a connection to be made between your academic interests and your work?" And I thought, sure. I didn't really know what I was doing in school. Like
Yeah.
I didn't have like a guide other than my professors to kind of offer me suggestions of what would be worthwhile things to dig into. And so I just started looking for these intersections and through different courses started writing papers and I I ended up um, writing a master's thesis on theological anthropology and disability and kind of trying to give this account of you know, from a Christian perspective, why do people with intellectual disabilities have worth? And I think that was good work. I was happy with that, but I did also feel at the end of that I was missing a little bit of like the so what question because you could say give that kind of pitch to people in churches and they go, oh yeah, I agree with that as well. And you're like, well, no, I don't really think that you're quite understanding what it is that I'm trying to say here and how like there is a little bit of kind of this subversive effect that takes place in thinking about this in the way that I want you to think about. And so then it was really those kind of unanswered questions and feeling like this all led me to a point where I almost had like these existential, like soul burning questions about the the kind of role and place and its influence really of people with intellectual disabilities that I just kind of stumbled across this section in Barth's work on witness that seemed really compelling. And in the circles that I kind of grew up in, witness was that kind of like rational, apologetic, evangelistic impulse where you go and like verbally declare um, the gospel, maybe some version of like the Romans Road or some like Billy Graham-esque thing. And that was never super compelling to me. But what Bart was trying to describe and this kind of was a more holistic vision of witness that is lived out in the kind of the concrete realities of everyday life. I wondered if there was something to explore there between that intersection and the lives of people with intellectual disabilities. And so to kind of tell the story of how I got into disability theology, well, I'll mention Carlos's interview again because I think
Mhm.
it really left a mark on me. He talked about I can't remember exactly how he put it, like these like micro moments of fidelity that kind of all build up on one another and lead to the next thing. And so the story of my introduction to disability theology was also a kind of a story of many of these small moments kind of leading me to this place where now all of a sudden I'm trying to do some sort of heavy lifting in these theological spheres, but to do that from my time and experience working with, and I would say even befriending people with intellectual disabilities, and that somehow the perspective that is gained through this work has something directly to say to my own theological convictions.
There's a few thoughts that I have, but the first one that jumps to my mind, right, is that these micro moments and saying yes to each of the moments that are presented to you, like just number one, showing up and saying yes when you get there, and approaching it in an open way, like what that can lead to. And I think I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this, right? I think one if you are involved in this world in any way, very few people at this juncture will disagree with a statement like people with disabilities have worth or we should be more inclusive. Like it's just not cool
Yeah.
to be like, no, they don't, and no, we shouldn't, right?
Yeah.
Although there is a resurgence of people who are actually, taking that route and just saying, well, no, that I just don't care, right? Okay, but most people in our so-called liberal, democratic, progressive, society wouldn't go that route, and they'd say, yeah, yeah, I agree. But then when the invitation is extended to make good on your agreement of that, like, well, can we shift this aspect of what we do here, or we're doing something, do you want to come? Well, that's when there's actually a required investment beyond just like the acknowledgement of a, abstract principle. And then you really see how open people are to making good on that, right? So, and that's when you get, well, surely we can't make that adjustment for one person, or we don't have the budget, or now's not a good time, or go talk to these people. They're really all about that, right? Um, and I've experienced that, and my guess is that you have too. And one of the things that both in the academic work, but just in the practical work, friendships, relationships, showing up, like wanting to just invite people into that world, because once you're there and you you don't want to leave, you just want to go deeper, and wanting
Mhm.
people to experience that, not shaming them like, oh, why don't you want to be a part of this, you must be a bad person, but like, you are missing out
Mhm.
on so much,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so it is this strange thing of writing about that from an academic perspective, speaking about that from an academic perspective. It all seems a little bit too intellectual to just extend that invitation, but there's value to it,
Mhm.
right? Right, you're forming a theological account of why we would bother, why would we care,
Yeah.
why would we go beyond what's familiar and comfortable, and go into this world. um but yeah, I mean, as I hear you talk, those are the thoughts that emerge for me. How does what I'm saying resonate with you?
Yeah, I think that you're drawing in some really really incisive and insightful comments here. One of the things that I try to give voice to in my work is that I really do believe that life spent around disability in the various kind of manifestations that we name disability, that it really rewires our perceptions, and it forces us to think with the world, or think with disability within the world, in a way that we can get by without if we just ignore the presence of people with disabilities, and if we ignore those realities. And so this, I mean, this touches on a bit of a um I guess a critical juncture in the work that I do, is that I think everyone who works in disability theology has some sense of the practical importance of this. What is sometimes missing is some of the kind of really heavy, weighty theological engagement with it. But I think that those two are really necessary because of exactly the thing that you were trying to say before. Is like one of the things that I come up against in my work is that um, I'll kind of expose the idea that, maybe we're not taking seriously enough the role or the place of people with disabilities in our communities. Um, I have, a few different kind of exercises that I do with students, or I've done with churches or small groups, that to try to draw people into, hey, I bet you that you know someone with a disability. Like I don't, you might think of this as a foreign reality, but if you spend like 30 seconds thinking about it, you probably know someone, and that person's either in your family, they're in your church, you grew up with them, you see them in the neighborhood, walking by, wheeling by. You know someone, but have you ever really reflected on them, and reflected on their perspective, and the kind of their own situatedness in life? And what I come up against with churches is that people really, we all do. I do. We get really comfortable in our structures. We get really comfortable in our institutions. Um, and so what happens is that people just want kind of another add-on. It's like the expansion pack to the life of the church that we're already living. Oh, my Settlers of Catan game would be so much better if I just got, this expansion pack,
Hmm.
or whatever it is, right? And so we think of disability ministry as this expansion pack that we can just tack on, and that's what people want from me. But that's not what I want to give people,
Hmm.
because I think that short circuits things.
Hmm.
what I actually want to try and dig into is a harder task. Um, it's a task that requires a whole lot more vulnerability, both on my part, but on other individuals' part, is that I want us to be vulnerable to the possibility that maybe our perceptions need to be rewired,
Yeah.
and that maybe we haven't been attending to the voices of people with disabilities in our midst. One of the big rallying cries of the disability rights movement over the last 30, 35 years has been this line, nothing about us without us. And I'm not a person who identifies as disabled. Maybe one day I will. Um, their disability is both something that we're born with, but also something that we may acquire. And I was just having a conversation yesterday with someone who had an invisible disability for many years and had kind of one relationship with that, and people had a relationship with her, but then she acquired a visible disability later in life, and people's relationship to her and her disability changed. So I may be disabled at one point in my life. We may all be disabled at one point in our life in various ways. But what I hope that I can do is to play some sort of a role in clearing space for both disabled voices and perspectives to be heard and encountered, but also to maybe be a conduit for relationships. I had a chance in our seminary last semester to teach a course on theology and disability. And the assignment that I was most excited for, and that I think in hindsight the students resonated most with, was that I asked them to do a series of interviews,
Hmm.
one with a disabled person, one with a pastor, and one with a caregiver. And I gave them like some prompts that they could kind of use, but I didn't want it to just be a kind of a checklist. Okay, what do you think about this question? What do you think about this question? I want to use the questions as just a launching point into further conversation, to give them kind of some freedom to some both a launching point, but freedom into just let the conversation go and actually hear from the people that you're engaging with, and question what they're having to say, and learn with and from. And I think to a person they all encountered new perspectives, even in interviews with people that they'd known for years. They'd never really taken the time to ask, well, what is your relation to your disability? How do you understand your disability in light of the Christian life? And I mean, one of the things there too is that I think is important to mention is that, when we think about some of these more kind of constructive theological categories, we might assume that what emerges is like the disability perspective,
Hmm.
but that doesn't exist. And so what my students were finding is that, sometimes answers from disabled people were running in different directions.
Right.
Um, and so I think what's important here is not to get the disabled perspective, because that doesn't exist. But what is important is recognizing that often unintentionally, like I do want to give most people the benefit of the doubt, not to excuse them, but to just like actually be truthful about this situation, is that most people I don't think are actively trying to exclude people with disabilities, but at the same time have not done enough to think about the kind of uh, normative assumptions that we carry with us into our life and into our churches and into our theology,
Hmm.
that were they to include and consider the polyphony, the cacophony of voices that make up the disabled community in its various iterations, that isn't just the expansion pack add-on, but that
Yeah.
it actually is going to require some rewiring.
Hmm. I love that analogy. I'm going to use it, and I
Right.
always cite my source. But you're no, it's totally right, because a lot of people are fine adding a program on
Yeah.
or referring people to his service. But what you're saying, and I totally agree, is like it's not an expansion pack. It it may start as that, maybe, but actually it's a whole different game.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, and I think that's why there's the resistance to like the micro moment of like there's I don't think a lot of people are conscious of it, but they're like, I like my game.
Yeah.
I'm
Oh
fine
yeah.
with my game. I like Catan, and the most I will do is add something onto it, right?
Yeah.
And uh and it's not just, I think, like Michael or Daniel being like, but maybe if we are identifying as disciples in the church, that actually maybe the way that you're playing the game, or maybe we need to be playing a different game. Like, I don't think it's you and I just saying that. Like, I think if you actually go to the Gospels, you see that happening all the time, where it's like you have the people who are the, keepers of the law and the teachers of the law and the interpreters of the law, and then the Messiah shows up and we're like, you're getting the game wrong. And the game that you're playing, actually, kind of funny that it benefits you and doesn't benefit these people who aren't in
Yeah.
positions of influence and who are considered the outcasts of the outcasts of the outcasts. You're playing the game wrong. And some people hear that and are like, gosh, I'm playing the game wrong. Like, help me sort this out. I want to follow you. Other people are like, experience that and they're like, amazing. This is great. I got to go tell people. And then other people are like, nope, we're going to kill you. Like, but like, if you're not willing to change the game, or at the very least how you play the game, I don't think you can be a disciple, because that's precisely what God shows up to do.
Hmm.
And you either receive that as a threat and you act accordingly, or you receive that with curiosity or maybe even joy,
Yeah. It's interesting because
right?
fundamental to pretty much every stripe of Christianity, doesn't matter who you ask, some level of the concept of conversion is
Yeah.
essential.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who you are, but some level of conversion is essential. Maybe even you'll get something about sanctification if you're
Maybe.
really feeling like you want to live the holy life.
Mhm.
But the idea of change is baked in.
Mhm.
But for many of us, well, that's just a thing that happened a long time ago. I
Yeah.
did convert already, um, but um, what then results is I think like I'm actually very comfortable using the language of sin here,
Hmm.
um, as the thing that we continually need to be liberated from, not as a way of trying to condemn those who are not doing the work, but to place ourselves in the kind of middle space that we find ourselves in between creation and redemption, is that there is something that is intentionally obfuscating both our relationship with God and our relationship with others. And so even though I'm not huge into slogans and mottos personally, the thing that has become kind of the calling card for the way that I think about the Christian life is Luther's first thesis, is that when our Lord and Master Jesus Christ said repent, he wills the entire life of the Christian to be one of repentance. Well, if that's true, maybe my preference is the way that I like to go to church, and I like the church that we go. I don't want to change that. I like a lot of the things about the place that I teach. I don't want to change a lot of those. I don't like change. Like my wife will readily admit that of me. Like I like my comfortable
Hmm.
places. Um, so don't hear me trying to excuse myself here. But what if we are all like we all continue to be plagued by sin, and that affects the way that we build our structures and our institutions and our preferred modes of functioning, and what if that becomes something that we need to repent of, not to kind of like just burden ourselves with heaps of guilt, but
Mhm.
that actually this act of repentance is essential if we want to move towards the liberation that comes on the other side of the repentance. And like we're not none of us are free from this. We 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 don't get to sit in the privileged position of having overcome sin or mastered sin. I wish we could. And
Mhm.
yeah, there's ways that sin has been talked about that have been bad and haven't been helpful to this. But at the same time, I think that this is actually critical to our own rationalization and realization of the importance for confronting our own status quos.
Yeah.
And that maybe even the thing that I hold most dear is something that is blocking someone else's participation in the body of Christ. And that sucks to have to recognize that, but that also sucks for the person who's being kept out. And maybe I have the responsibility to think about my own life and my own self in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this does connect to your work on witness insofar as you talked about how you grew up and how witness was treated, and oftentimes like witness is a very it's treated as a very sort of like outward um, sort of projecting thing where it's like it's me going out to witness to people, but and like winning souls for Jesus, and that
Mm.
sort of thing. But there's another side of witness where actually who is in my midst witnessing to me, and it's not always something that we immediately experience as witness that brings joy or excitement or like actually what
No.
about the other side of witness that makes us uncomfortable, that shakes up like expectations, that actually prompts me to consider that there's more to God than I thought. Like that's a part of witness too. And I can see, even going back to like the earliest parts of our conversation, of like the witness of particularity
Mhm.
and how much of the structures that we have built insulate us from encountering the particularity of all people. And then the more you encounter the particularity of all people, disabled or not disabled, the more we realize how uncertain and fragile life is. And then the more we realize how uncertain fragile life is, the more we realize how uncertain and fragile I am and my existence is. And
Mhm.
this is what I tell the undergrad students that I teach in this course that I do on theology, anthropology, and disability is like, look, you alluded to it, and the reality is if you're not disabled now, you probably will be. Just get older,
Yeah.
right? We're all going that way.
Just wait a few
Yeah,
years.
and we can't get out of life alive. I'm like rosy thoughts, in class, but I'm like, we spend so much of our life insulating ourselves from the reality that life is but a breath. From dust we come, to dust we return. And sometimes in life, there's circumstances or there are people who remind us of that, and that's perceived as a threat. But
Hmm.
yeah, okay, it's scary, it's existentially disabling, right? It's not as fun as your TikTok reels or whatever show you're streaming on Netflix, but it's actually a more honest and concrete account of what life is. On the other side of that is the realization that God is still here despite that uncertainty and fragility, and so are these people, and I can learn and journey with these people in friendship. But I think so much of our life, when we're building up structures and things to insulate us from that witness is perceived as a threat. So I want to get into your work on Barth, witness and disability. And before we get into that, I do want to talk about Barth himself. I feel like it is important to address the elephant in the room, as it were, just with the more recent information that's sort of come out about Barth's relationship with Charlotte von Kirschbaum. And some would say that that has compromised his witness, despite all of the influence that his theology has had and his biography has had. So before we get into Barth's theology of witness, do you want to talk a little bit about it as a Barth scholar, how you're negotiating what's going on? And maybe even for people who aren't aware, can you sort of talk us through what was going on with Barth and his I think it was his secretary, right? Or his research
Yeah.
assistant. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, I won't get all the dates on the historical timeline accurate. So
totally fine.
I'm not even going to try to do that route.
Yeah.
If anybody wants to read more, Christiana Tietz has become one of the more authoritative voices in this conversation. But I think that, maybe even before we get into that, but certain figures in history, certain figures in the history of theology and Christianity take on multiple lives, and Barth is one of those. And so like there are Barth is probably one of the more polarizing figures at the moment for a whole host of different reasons. I think a good chunk of that is because of the way that Barth's scholars have acted and the way that they've treated other people. Hasn't always been, ironically, given what we're talking about today, a faithful witness.
Hmm.
Um, and so Barth has multiple lives, it seems like. There's the Barth of the text, there's the Barth of the world of scholarship and how he's been used, but then there is the still probably most essentially the real human of Karl Barth, who was born at the end of the 19th century, died in the middle of the 20th century, and he was a man who served first after doing some theological education, never got a PhD, but worked as a pastor in the village of Zoffinville, and he got really involved in the workers' rights movement there. He got the nickname the Red Pastor. Got involved in teaching catechesis in his church, and that's where he met Nellie, his who ended up being his wife. Um, and they married, and they had a number of kids together. Fast forward a number of years, Barth has left Zoffenville. I don't exactly remember the point that Charlotte von Kirschbaum comes into his life, but Barth um, he takes to her quite quickly, and they fall in love. Um, Now, where things get really complicated is, these days, if something like that would happen, um, the natural course of things is that, well, probably Carl and Nellie are just going to get a divorce. They'll share custody of the kids until they're old enough. They'll probably Carl will run off with Charlotta. Nellie will hopefully find love again somewhere. People can still look down on Bart, absolutely. It's not the honorable thing to dispose of your wife uh, in that way, but this kind of thing happens. And generally speaking, again, I don't want to absolve Bart of any guilt here. Generally speaking, we've kind of come to terms with that as a society and said, like, yeah, okay, we can work with that. Well, that's just not the reality at Bart's time. Um, at, at at different points in their relationship, Carl and Nellie both want a divorce. Not at the same time, though. And again, for better or for worse, um, I think the timeline is Bart wants the divorce first, and then, but Nellie says no, and then Nellie wants it, but Bart says no. The reason that Bart says no, is at that time, Nellie's option would have essentially been poverty. Um, the remarriage would not have been an option at that time and in that context. And so, at least to a degree, um, again, many people will look at this and say Bart's still in the wrong. Yeah, probably. But it's a little bit more complicated here. Charlotta ends up moving into the Bart household, and there's correspondence between um, the kids that speak of her as a joyful presence. She has her own room, which is connected to Bart's study. Um, there's certain issues that come up with that as well. Um, as far as we know, I mean, again, this doesn't excuse it. It just puts it into context. We don't know, but there's no real evidence of any sexual activity between them, mostly because that's a time before birth control exists. So if something like that's happening, there's likely going to be evidence of it.
Hmm.
Um, but where things kind of really get complicated, I think, is actually after Bart dies. So Bart calls this the German term is Nachgemeinschaft or the troubled union. Um, and near the end of Bart's life, Charlotta gets really sick and she has to go into a home. Um, Bart then dies. Nellie outlives them all, and yet she goes and continues to visit Charlotta. Um, so again, this is a really complicated story. It's one where there are absolutely bad actors in, but it's not cut and dry. And it's interesting. One of the more influential moments of my time as a PhD student at Aberdeen was we've already mentioned Michael and I had a shared PhD supervisor, although we were at Aberdeen at different times.
Hmm.
Our supervisor, Brian Brock, he was involved in, we had an ethics seminar every term where most of the time what we would do is we would just take a book or two books and work through them together. So in my time there, we read through things like David Clough's volumes on animals, or we read um, Jake's translations of Ellul's To Will and To Do.
Hmm.
We read the Rule of Saint Benedict. We read Barth's Ethics. Um, but probably the most influential one was a seminar that Brian put together called The Troubled Inheritance, where we tried to look at the work of three figures that loomed large at Aberdeen, Barth, John Howard Yoder, and Jean Vanier, to look at their theology in light of the allegations that had come out against all of them, and to do a kind of close reading of some essential texts on things like gender or marriage or relationships with one another. And
And
one of
power.
the one of the interesting things that emerged there is I do think that the Bart situation is different. I don't think it's as directly an abusive relationship as the kind of abuses that Yoder came out looking the worst of the bunch. Vanier not too far behind him, um, simply because of the quantity of women involved and the way the extent to which their power was used. But the Bart situation is a lot more complex, and it's interesting that many of the kind of early scholarship that considers the role and place of Charlotte von Kirschbaum in all of this is done by feminist scholars who their concern is Charlotte getting her due in the work that Bart produces, because there's no question about it that the church dogmatics doesn't happen without Charlotte von Kirschbaum.
Hmm.
So much so that scholars like David Clough who have done a lot of work on Bart. He's done a lot of work in his career with Bart. He now refers to the work of Bart and von Kirschbaum.
Hmm.
And so it's interesting that these are the conversations that are happening in these kind of early feminist receptions of Bart. Um, and so it's not an easy story.
Hmm.
It's a life that is shot through with contradictions in many ways. And again, some people will hear this and that's enough for them to never pick up Bart. And honestly, fine. Like I'm not gonna try and convince anyone otherwise. Um, but at the same time, I while Bart's life remains inexcusable in some ways. It's also deeply complex. And Barth himself, who has penned these like really beautiful, deep treatises on grace, have said that struggling through this troubled union had forced him to reconsider grace, and so he recognized his own part to play in this. He wasn't trying to brush this off.
Mhm.
He recognized that he has a very significant role to play here. But again, for better or for worse, whether we agree with him or not, um, he felt like his hands were tied a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
And so I think that if people are wanting to know more about this, again, don't take my word for it. Go deal with Christiana Tietz. Is She's the one who has kind of come to yeah uh
Just I
she
have this
yeah,
book right
Karl
here.
Barth, A Life in Conflict. Yeah, I actually
Yeah,
saw that
yeah.
on your
I
on your
just,
shelf
oh, you
there.
did. Oh, you did. You
Yeah,
saw
I
it.
did. Yeah,
We
it's
could have
it's
like edited a little circle, ding. But yeah, I took it
yeah.
off. But it's kind of like
um
Jenga here. My office is very small, and I just have one bookshelf. I don't have any more room, so that
yeah.
explains the atrocious state of my
So
bookshelf. Sorry.
it's a great book that I think it really helps to. I think it, like, anyone who's interested in learning more about Barth's theology should read
Yeah.
that book.
Mhm.
But she has a chapter in there where she tackles this stuff head on, because um Bart and Charlotta and Nellie exchanged a lot of letters, and those letters were held by the kids, and then were passed on to their grandkids and kept private for many, many years. And Teets was the one who the I think it was the grandkids got in touch with, and they handed the letters over. So she's one of the only people in the world who's seen that private correspondence. So I think her voice in this is worth taking a lot more seriously than my voice in this.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's really helpful because we touched on this actually in the interview that I did with Kevin O'Farrell about the figure
Mhm.
of Bonhoeffer and his witness, and Kevin used the example of Vanier, and you brought up Jean Vanier, and it, Kevin just said, and I think he's right, and it's similar to what you're saying, is we have to be careful about how much we build up certain figures, and how do we acknowledge and engage and learn from their witness in such a way that we do learn and grow from it, but we also don't build them up to something beyond what they were and what they are, and what happens when we project too much on them, and how does that actually even like is part of the problem, right? Like we put too much um, expectation and power on certain people, and that power warps. It just does. And most people think that they're going to be the exception to the rule, but the reality is that they're not. I mean, this is something Ellul has written about extensively, is everybody thinks they're going to be able to handle the amount of power that they desire well. They're going to handle it for good, but it has a warping effect. And so um, approaching that carefully, and then with the legacies of thinkers that have shaped so many people, um, not explaining away the wrongs that they've done, but having a clear perspective on it, of that we are all liable to doing the same things. And the minute that we think that we're not, we're in trouble. Um, and it, you know, I think this is where the rubber really hits the road in terms of, I mean, I've thought about this in my own sort of walk, is like, what is more important? Writing a massive 12 volume, collection on theology that shapes the world. But what does that matter if at the end of the day, your mother-in-law comes to you and says, you've shipwrecked this family on theology? And that's, famously what Barth's mother-in-law said. It was his
Mhm.
mother-in-law, right?
That I it could be, yeah.
I think it was.
Yeah.
Anyway, but basically, and now we like, well, it wasn't just like the amount that he worked theologically. I think there are all the things that we're talking about are layers to it, right? But like what ultimately matters is even the amount of influence you have or the type of person you are and the type of like relationships that you had and how that leaves behind a certain legacy too.
Mhm.
So yeah, I appreciate yeah your perspective and just your willingness to say like, you know, for some people that will be enough cause to put down his work and not engage it. And for others it may not. But that is at the discretion of different folks. And you know, for some it's too fresh to even generate an answer to it, and others it's, you know, approach with caution, others like no way, no how.
Yeah.
So having said that, let's venture into his work on witness and how you are using it to um, inform the conversation around disability and witness, because this is a common theme within disability theology, you know, especially within the academic world, is how do you engage and share and think through the stories of people who may not be able to sit down and write their own story or
Mhm.
tell you their story. um, and so it is a theme, but you're introducing a perspective that is probably different than the common way of doing it. So do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that, you're exactly right about the impulses for why people write this kind of thing. You mentioned earlier the rallying cry of the disability rights movement about nothing about us without us, and I firmly believe that, but at the same time, the one person who figured most prominently on my mind as I wrote all this was my friend Paul. And Paul was one of the guys whose home I worked in for 3.5 years while I was in grad school, and a little bit beyond that, as I was kind of transitioning towards my time at Aberdeen. And Paul, he actually just passed away a few months ago, but he was a man who had cerebral palsy. And um, I would imagine that most people, the first time they would meet Paul or someone like Paul, would have no idea what to do with him, because cerebral palsy is one of those interesting disabilities where you have some people who, like, there's influencers who have cerebral palsy who can speak very clearly and do a great job in the public sphere. But then there's people like Paul who could not speak. And Paul was one of the people who we needed to bathe and help toilet and feed and get him dressed. And my worry was that if if we are going to rightfully follow um there's nothing about us without us, well, who speaks for Paul? Because Paul could communicate. He would look up for yes and down for no. And there were some other kind of mannerisms that he had that you could really form a deep relationship with him. And unfortunately, I'm going to be missing his funeral, but I've heard that they're expecting a packed room because he touched a lot of people's lives.
Mm.
He didn't speak with words, but he touched a lot of people's lives. Another example would be Brian Brock's son Adam, who he writes about extensively in Wondrously Wounded.
Mhm.
And Adam can't speak, but don't you dare believe for a second that you can't communicate with him.
Mhm.
So I think, Brian in Wondrously Wounded, he presents one of the better examples out there of he says that what he's doing is trying to be a witness to Adam's witness. And so I talked before about the rewiring that comes from spending time with people with disabilities, and clearly I'm not the only one who's experienced that, because yeah, one of the themes that kind of comes through a lot in in writing on disability is, especially writing on intellectual disability, is that I've been changed by this. Probably the most prominent writer in that is Vanier, Stanley Hauerwas as well. Both of them have been accused, and I think to a degree the accusations probably hold of instrumentalizing people with disabilities and kind of just pointing to them as a category because this is the problem is that my life was changed working with people with intellectual disabilities, but I had coworkers who did not like the people that we supported.
Hmm.
They were professional enough to do the job, and no, I don't, as far as I know, no abuse ever took place, but they didn't like the people. So it's false to say just spend time around people with intellectual disabilities and your life will be changed. I saw it not happen.
Right.
So then how do we talk about this? Like what's actually going on here? If we can't just say spend time in this place, spend time with these people and your life will be changed. How can we interrogate that a little bit? That's what where I found a kind of a helpful resource in thinking along this with Bart is that for Bart, there's very little in the Christian life that is programmatic. There's very little um he makes very little of I mean, it's a really common um practice now in kind of theology and ethics circles today is the kind of resurgence of practices. Barth makes very little of that. Not none, but very little of that in his own work and in his own writing, because um, one of the fundamental impulses that runs through really all of his work is the freedom of God,
Right.
and that God is not a being who can just kind of be coerced or duped or our relationship with God isn't just like it's not just transactional. It's not this economy of exchange where if I give you five prayers, you give me this much grace.
Mhm.
And so we have to be thinking differently about the way that the Spirit is working. And Bart often gets accused of not having a pneumatology, and I think people just aren't reading Bart because I think that the spirit is everywhere in Bart's work. The spirit is what allows the work of Christ to affect individuals in Bart's work. And so what I found in Bart was a way to speak about the witness of people with intellectual disabilities that first of all provides a framework for um I guess to be a witness. um One of the things that I often tell the students is to be a witness you have to actually be present. Like I can't just go up to the law courts one day and knock on the door or go up to the secretary or the receptionist being like, hey, do you need any witnesses today? I would really love to be a witness today. Any good cases? I think I could do a real good job witnessing. No, the people who can be a witness are the people who have some sort of connection or
Yeah.
relationship to
They were
either
there.
the
Yeah.
scene of the crime or the individuals on trial. Like there has to be that connection there.
Mhm.
So if you want to talk about the witness of people with intellectual disabilities, first of all, you have to talk about, well, what are they witnessing to?
Hmm.
How do they come to know? Well, that gets into certain questions when you talk about epistemology and intellectual disability. So first of all, how is this thing that they are witnessing to received? And then second of all, how is it dispensed? And then how do we encounter them dispensing that? Because well, they might get too far ahead of things as I've said already, like if I'm going to make a claim that the people that I was engaging with may have been engaging not just in like neat behavior that's worth attending to, but actually like are engaging in Christian witness, then I have to be able to give an account of what might be going on in that allows this to occur. And so I think so. Yeah, Bart gave me language to do
Yeah.
that and to think about that.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about this, how Bart has certain controlling principles in his work, and one of those being just the centrality of God to all of it, and the freedom of God, and the action of God, right? So from our place on the ground, so often we want to emphasize our capacities to act, our capacities to make change and change ourselves, change other people, and so on. But what Bart is always pushing is, if we're talking about anything to do with Christianity, we need to be emphasizing the prior action of God that makes all action possible.
Mhm.
And the way that it works out in witness is that, how does the prior action of God work in and through people in such a way that those people may not be fully conscious actually of the witness that they are bearing, right? Or, I mean, reading your chapter that you did for the Office in Theology volume, you talk about Barth's famous saying that God can speak to us through all manner of people and things. Uh, he's that free, right? Or God is
Yeah,
that free.
yeah.
But as it works out with people, one of the scriptural scenes that comes into mind for me is the rich man and Lazarus, right? Or the people who are by the pools as well. Like you say, like what are they witnessing to? They're witnessing to those who have eyes to see, ears to hear, that a lot of people just don't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a witness.
Yeah.
And then hopefully they witness to the fact that God is nevertheless there and at work, even when a lot of people don't care and just walk by the man named Lazarus, who's leprous and hurt and needs help. Um, so hopefully they witness to that, but nevertheless something's going on there, and how conscious is Lazarus that he's doing that? Maybe not totally, maybe
Yeah.
not totally ever. But the point is that God works in the world in such a way that the witness happens.
Mhm.
And further, going back to what you're saying about somebody like Paul or somebody like Adam, you're totally right that some people's lives can be drastically changed. Um, and others, it pushes them further into less care, right? Like, I spent a lot of
Mhm.
time, and all I know is that I'd like to spend less time,
Yeah.
right? But one of my friends is researching the area of like mutuality models of discipleship, right? So
Mm.
how do we actually talk about Paul discipling people?
Mhm.
How do we talk about Adam discipling people? Because I think, like, yes, there is witness, but also God is working through them in such a way that a lot of people would approach someone like Paul, or Adam, or right, and say, I'm the one who's going out of my way to care for and spend time with and maybe disciple.
Yeah.
But sooner or
Yeah.
later, there's a change that happens in which, if like, oh my goodness, I'm the one being cared for. I'm the one being discipled, right?
Mhm.
And so again, like, if that has happened to you, as you look back on it, like, what account do you give of it? Like, how do you make sense of it so that you might encourage other people to be more attentive to the way in this witness is happening, a way this discipleship might be happening, which looks totally different than the
Yeah.
latest discipleship curriculum that is, being sold on the
Yeah.
shelves of Christian
Yeah.
bookstores everywhere, right? So am I
Yeah.
getting you right here? Am I hearing you right here?
Yeah. I think the most, I think, difficult thing, and the thing that makes me do a little moment into the inner life of Daniel here. The thing that makes me question my own work in the first place is that it intentionally cannot end with me.
Mhm.
Is that my work, like it actually doesn't, if all that you get out of my work is that Daniel gave a nice account of the witness with people with disabilities, then my work has actually failed.
Mm.
but my work ends, or my work's direction is go yourself and spend time with people with intellectual disabilities. Go yourself and do that thing. Because um, I mean, I have to acknowledge, sure, yeah, God might speak through me in my work. I have to acknowledge that as a possibility, but that's not the point. The point is, as we were saying before, there's this group of people who continue to change lives all over the world. Yet the church, more often than not, there's some places that are doing a great job of this, but more often than not, the church doesn't even notice that these people are missing.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's where you need to go. That's where the work cashes out, is that I think the work itself stands as its own kind of call, that in you know there's always a certain amount of biography and testimony in the theology that we write. And this, I'd said earlier, Brian frames wondrously wounded as his witness to Adam's witness, and in a sense, this book is kind of my testimony and my account, that hopefully, if I'm right, or even if I'm mostly right, and the beauty of theology is that if I'm at least mostly right, somebody else can come along and correct me and
Mhm.
give a better account. But even if I'm mostly right, that maybe someone will take up this work and then go and also engage. And maybe if they're lucky, their lives will be changed as well. Or
Mhm.
maybe their perceptions will be rewired.
And I think this leads into your focus on participation, right? Like it the action of God is happening whether we're attentive to it or not. The witnessing is happening whether we're attentive to it or not. The question is will we catch up with the work that's already being done
Mhm.
by Spirit and participate?
Yeah.
Because there's some who are and there are some who are not. And I don't want to be the person in Matthew 25 who's like, when did we care for you? Like, I don't want to be that guy. As a theologian, that's my biggest fear of Jesus coming
Yeah.
back and be like, hey, Jesus, I did so many awesome things for you. And he's like, wait a second, who are you? So how does participation factor into what you're talking about, right? Like, go. And then once you're there, how do we engage in such a way that we are participating more and not less? And I think what God seems to be doing in this world.
Yeah, I think that I make a lot about witness, and the call that is invoked in witnessing, but the call is only like the the starting gun that the sprinters hear, that signals them to go. The participation is what follows. And I think you get this impulse in both Barth and Bonhoeffer, but I've been teaching church history in our seminary this semester, and I'm not a historian, I'm a theologian, and so that affects my approach. And what we've been doing is we've been spending a lot of time in primary texts. And I think that the majority report from the Christian tradition is that the purpose of this life is to live in God.
Mhm.
And that gets parsed in so many different ways. Um, and the account that Bart gives about participation is going to be different in some ways very different than the account of someone like Maximus the Confessor. But at the end of the day, they're trying to do something similar and to suggest that like we are created for life with God. And that what we lose in our sinfulness is life with God. That's the rupture that occurs. That's the thing that reconciliation repairs is our union and our participation in God. And so the account that I want to give is, we often, again, we in our contemporary moment and in many of the years leading up to this, we think of our participation in very kind of fragmented yet cognitive modes. We think of at least in the circles that I've rolled in, we think of how I relate to God um, by what I can kind of like rationally give an account of what I'm giving to God. But I think that it God doesn't just call us to think nice thoughts about God, but that all of Christian life is part of the movement into deeper life with God, and that's not something that you need a particular rationality or cognitive ability to achieve, but that some that all human beings, all creatures, but all human beings for sure are are given both this call and this opportunity to participate in God. And it's in this participation that we come to know God deeper, which is then the catalyst which allows us to witness.
Hmm.
Because again, without that participation, without that relationship, without that connection, you can't witness. Like categorically, it cannot happen.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in my work, there's a bit of ground clearing that has to take place before we actually get to the what I call the activity of witness.
Hmm.
But that God provides the means by which we can come to participate in God. And that even in our fallenness, God does not so fully abandon us that we are forever rejected and never enabled to participate more fully in the life of God. And that is true for the person with the highest IQ, and that's true of the person who lived their life locked up in an institution because they didn't meet certain societal standards. And that so cognition is not a precondition of participation.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And you're so right that we tend to make like we, the universal we, like it so much is about like cognitive assent to uh ideas, beliefs, values, and then even with participation. So it's like people are like, so how do I participate then? And well, it's quite simple. Show up, right?
Yeah.
Someone suggests maybe you might be interested in this job. Give it a go,
Yeah.
right? And be open to learning and changing as you go there. But I think, one of the sort of metrics or heuristics that I give these days, um, I don't think it's going to sell any books. I don't even know if you can do a whole book on it, but I'm like, how do I know if my church is healthy? I'm like, here's one. Uh, do the people in your congregation have meals together? And when they do get together to have meals, does everybody at that table look the same, talk the same, move the same, come from the same social class? If the answer is that's not happening, probably not, if to use participation language, probably not participating at the depth that you could be in the life of God. Because
Yeah.
everything that we see in scripture is it's creating that. It's creating that type of meal. It's creating that type of community that like, well, if it wasn't for, the action of God in this context, we probably wouldn't be hanging out, would we? No, probably not. But isn't it amazing that we've been all like brought together and we are hanging out, and then
Yeah.
like what transpires as we get together and do this is actually world-changing things, but like it's not us doing it. It's God doing it through us, but we just are just showing up and willing to spend time with this person who I thought I had nothing in common with and could never witness to me and could never disciple me, but oh my goodness, now they are,
Yeah.
right? And so it's like that's the metric of your participation. And if you don't have that, it's actually not that hard.
And
And
you know
just
you
look around in your midst of the
yeah,
people, right? And just say, hey, want it, like, let's spend time together and see what happens.
yeah. And you know you've done work on Pentecost, but
Hmm.
Pentecost has become such like kind of one of these really important places to dig in scripturally on this account. When I think at least one of the things that you can glean from it is that the standards that you thought you needed to meet in order to participate in God are actually not the standards. And that something about the languages tied to the cultures and the diversity of peoples that get these funny little tongues of fire on their head at Pentecost is representative of where the Spirit is going to be moving. And then one of the messages of the book of Acts is that people don't like that because it's scary. Because all of a sudden these peoples who look different than you and talk different than you and have different presuppositions than you are also welcomed. No,
Yeah.
no, no, no. That can't be right. We know that that's not how God has acted. But
Yeah.
but it's a story of this grafting in of this Gentile people, and then we forget because of the history of Christianity and the place that people like you and I in the West occupy is that we forget that we're the ones that were grafted into.
I said this in my conversation with Grace Ji Sun Kim, right? It's
Yeah.
almost as if Paul didn't write Romans 11 about the
Yeah.
wild branches being
Yeah.
grafted into the natural ones. And
Yeah.
then now the wild ones are like, yeah, we're the natural branches, none of you wild ones. It's like, what? Where did we go
Yeah.
wrong here? But
Yeah.
that's
And
totally
like,
the problem.
you know, the warning to Israel as they're about to enter into the land of the promise is don't
Mhm.
forget your time as a sojourner.
Yeah.
And like look out for those in your midst
Yeah.
that have been kept out because I'm the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You
Mhm.
don't get here
Mhm.
without the work of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so don't forget that this isn't your merit that you're running
Mhm.
with here,
Mhm.
Israel. And I think the church today, many of us, I mean, it's not your merit here that you're running with.
Yeah.
You have are the ones that have been grafted in. You are the ones who were nothing, yet the door was open for you.
Mhm.
You have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. You have participated in the feast and partaken in this feast. And so why are you not continuing to extend that?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
a
for
call to
sure.
really wrestle with the power that we have come to assume. And
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Oh, for sure. And so how do we, because this is what I often say, like one of the motifs throughout scripture is remembrance is a perennial problem. Like forgetting the position that you were in, because the position that you're in now has blinded you to where you were, right? And just remember what God did for you and where he's brought you now so that you have the same posture towards other people. And so this, I think, sets us up for the sort of final movements of liberation and affliction. Because, on the one hand, it's like, yeah, like rescue, freedom, or whatever. But then
yeah,
also you're like, but we don't get to resurrection, freedom, liberation without cross
yeah,
as well. So part of our participation are the benefits that we're, talking about, but there's also the struggle with it. So do you want to speak to how after witness participation, we get to liberation and affliction.
Yeah. Um, so one of the claims that I read out of Barth, I don't think that he would necessarily put it this way, but I think this gets at what he wants us to think about is, witness is necessarily a public activity. Like I can't just sit in my bedroom and like not have any connection to any other human being and be witnessing in that moment. But witness occurs in and amongst other people in the relationships that we find ourselves in that may be very happenstance and just occur in a very singular, isolated passing, or it might occur in the deep relationships that have been cultivated over time, but necessarily it has to happen in public. And where Barth says that takes you is that it would be really, really nice if, because the Spirit was working in us, that everyone was like, "Oh, yes, that's God. I like that." But I mean, we've already covered this before. Is that sometimes, well, sometimes witness does come as the fuzzy blanket that is laid over top of you that it feels like you can wrap yourself up in and feel all good about yourself. But sometimes witness really confronts you, and it can be jarring. And when people encounter that, some people take that in stride and um, they respond well. Many people, probably myself more often than not, don't respond well to such confrontation. And so then they lash out and they hit back. And Bart says that the witness will experience affliction. That's just part of the package. And it would be great if that didn't happen. But if we look at Jesus for a second, the story of Jesus and the witness of Jesus is that it got him killed. And so the cross and the place of suffering in the Christian life is essential, not because suffering needs to be valorized, or not because like we should go and Bart's not saying that you need to go seek out some more suffering, but he is saying if you're not suffering at all, ask yourself the question of whether you're really witnessing. And so it's not a way of, yeah, valorizing suffering so that the dangers that can lead us into when we're thinking about abusive situations and things like that. But and I really didn't want to write this chapter because people with disabilities, in my opinion, continue to be among the most oppressed, ostracized group in the world, particularly because um, of the different ways that they communicate that is often not heard by society, um, especially the ones who don't speak with words. But Bart's not valorizing suffering, but he is being realistic about the place of the cross and that, sometimes people are not going to accept the witness. Sometimes they're going to lash out. But while you're doing that, you can take heart because God has already gone there, and God continues to be there with you. But it's not all bad news. It's not all suffering either, because ultimately the place that he ends up is that witness does lead us to liberation. And then it's exactly on that point of participation in God that is the ultimate end of the Christian life, that as we are witnessing, we only witness insofar as we are participating in God. Therefore, as we come to live more fully in God, that's where we experience liberation. And so that as we are witnessing, We are actively encountered by liberation in the moment. That is a prefiguration of the ultimate liberation, the eschatological liberation that awaits us one day. But that um you know, as witnesses go in the world, you can expect that you will both encounter this affliction, but also, importantly, affliction's not the last word. Liberation is. And
Mhm.
that the one who witnesses is the one who experiences the liberation of God and is encountered by the liberation of God in a way that prefigures the eschatological liberation, and even maybe those who um, are encountered by the witnesses, those who recognize the witnesses, get what I call glimpses of the eschaton. And that for this kind of brief moment in time, and it can be quick, that there's some sort of divine inbreaking that happens through God's work through the witness that gives us a glimpse of what the kingdom of God really looks like, and gives us a glimpse of what the eschatological life is going to look like in its fullness one day when we get there.
Mhm.
And my kind of big claim there is that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, if you're spending time with people's intellectual disabilities, you too might, if you're so lucky, catch a glimpse of the eschaton through their witness.
Yeah, I think about the Apostle Paul, who talks about it all happening in the twinkle of an eye.
Mhm.
Um, and I think back on moments that I've shared with people, and just how, like, in the moment, how seemingly insignificant those moments are, but how actually the more distance that I have, the more reflection that I'm able to have on those moments. Those are those in-breaking moments where they happen in the twinkle of an eye, right? The and if we're not careful, we'll miss those moments because we're too distracted by bigger, better, flashier, more sustained moments that seem like they deliver, but they actually don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And you make a good point, I think, about looking back, because I
Mm-hmm.
think that that's an important thing that I don't take on directly at all in my work, but is kind of there, I guess, at a bit of a meta level in the way that I'm reflecting on my own
Mm-hmm.
encounters with people with disabilities, that these witnesses might happen in the moment. Will be encountered by them in the twinkle of an eye. But that doesn't mean that we can grasp their fullness in the moment. Sometimes these are things that we need to really chew on for a long time, but also it might even be the case that in kind of chewing on them for a long time, that if it really was God speaking through these individuals, that it will continue to edify you as you reflect back on that. I think of we again, at least in some of the circles that I operate in, we like to think about the manner in which we have access to God all the time, and uh, I'm just what that which then makes it a really big deal if we're not feeling God
Mm-hmm.
in any given moment. But I think that at least the witness of the Old Testament and the witness of the Gospels is that most people who are encountered by God don't experience God in the fullness of who God is all the time, forever and ever, but that they experience God in these very punctuated moments that then is the thing which sustains them for a really long time. And that, we get we can get really worked up if I haven't heard anything from God for a little while. Well, yeah, you and everybody else. And you and like the the host of witnesses that we encounter in the Bible,
Hmm.
right? Like I think of the examples of Jesus healing people and it's like go away.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
they all they have is this one moment to carry with them. Or like God encounters Moses or one of the prophets and it's like yeah, they just gotta go with that thing
Right.
for a long time. And we're just so used to having access to all sorts of things all whenever we want it that like if we're not like feeling God or we haven't heard from God for a long time, we think that there's something wrong with us. But I think that we can still maintain that God loves us and cares for us and is providing for us, even if we don't experience these kind of like dramatic moments on a regular basis. It doesn't mean it's not true and it's not how it happens. I think that
Mm.
if that, but the witness of scripture is that this is actually exactly how it happens, is
Yeah.
that in these kind of punctuated moments that will have to sustain you for a really long time.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, you make that point about the different prophets, right? And
Yeah.
we forget that Ezekiel laid laid around on one side for a couple hundred days or something, and then,
Yeah.
had to shift the other. And that spoke just as prophetically as like, the spoken words, but we're more interested in the words than we are about this weird prophet just having a lie around for a couple
Yeah.
hundred days. Well, thank you for your time. And when can we expect your book to come out? Because you're currently revising this, so this is like sneak preview. But when can the world read your book? I mean, they can read your dissertation, can't they? Yeah.
My dissertation is available. Yeah, I haven't embargoed it. So if you go on the Aberdeen website and find their library, you can punch my name in there and you'll find a version of it that as I've been revising has more typos than I originally thought when I was submitting it. Um,
Yeah.
but hopefully, yeah, I am working on revising it for publication. I've been in conversations with the publisher. There's no contract yet, so I won't maybe say too much about that. But hopefully, it's not too long.
Okay.
I don't have a timeline yet, unfortunately, but hopefully it's not too long.
Well, where can they follow you so that as soon as you know, we know?
Yeah, I mean, I am on some of the social media accounts. I still have a profile on X, although I don't really post there ever. So, but I've been trying out the blue sky thing. It's okay.
Yeah.
Um, but also I'm really happy to connect with people by email. You can find my email on my faculty page at Providence, or just Google Daniel Rempel Providence, and my page will pop up there. So, yeah, I'd be really happy to connect that way.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time, and pun very much intended. Thank you for your witness. Do people
Thanks,
do that all
Michael.
the time?
No, I think
Oh,
you're the
I'm the
first.
first. Okay, it hasn't become a cliche yet. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.